In 1946, as the dust of World War II still hovered over Europe and the continent hung awkwardly between devastation and reconstruction, a small archaeological team slipped almost unnoticed beneath Cologne Cathedral. What began as a modest post-war excavation, tucked away in technical notes and brief announcements, would later become one of the most quietly unsettling stories linked to monumental Old World architecture. There were no headlines, no grand public campaigns, just a short statement that work was beginning under the scarred but still standing cathedral. From that moment, what would later be remembered as a discreet, almost forgotten project slowly unfolded, what many now refer to as Operation Unearthing Cologne Cathedral. Officially, it was supposed to be little more than a scientific survey. In reality, it evolved into one of the most puzzling digs of the 20th century, leaving behind fragments of evidence and unanswered questions that still haunt researchers today. Cologne Cathedral itself had long been a riddle, even before anyone dug into its foundations. People had stared at it for generations and wondered how a structure so enormous, so ornamented, so mathematically refined could have risen in a medieval city, before cranes, industrial steel, powered tools, and modern engineering theory existed. Its twin towers still dominate the skyline, towering above the city like a relic from a civilization with different proportions and different expectations of what a building could be. The official narrative, however, has always filed it neatly under Gothic masterpiece, the result of centuries of labour by anonymous craftsmen slowly stacking stone on stone. For most visitors, that explanation sufficed. But those who pay attention to architectural anomalies, to the recurring pattern of oversized, overbuilt, and inexplicably precise structures, have long felt that something in that story did not quite fit. And when the excavation under the cathedral began in 1946, that nagging sense of incompleteness turned into something much stranger. The man in charge, Otto Doppelfeld, was a careful, conservative archaeologist known for methodical fieldwork and cautious interpretations. Yet, even he appears to have been unsettled by what emerged beneath the floor of the cathedral. Official reports, private notes, later assessments, and scattered references all describe something unusual. Construction phases that did not neatly match the accepted timeline. Instead of encountering a straightforward medieval foundation system, the team ran into deeper, older, more sophisticated stonework. It was as if the cathedral had been placed atop an already monumental structure, something larger, more exacting, and more advanced than the storybooks allowed. According to various accounts, the excavations exposed walls and chambers whose geometry did not align with the visible church above. Some looked like remnants of a much grander building whose proportions had no reflection in the modern ground plan. Certain surfaces showed signs of long-term water action, as though they had once been partially submerged or buried in layers of sediment. Other areas displayed stone joints so tight that even a thin blade would struggle to fit between them, far beyond the usual tolerance of traditional medieval masonry. Equally strange was the near silence surrounding the project. Across post-war Europe, many archaeological finds discovered during reconstruction were photographed, written about, and presented as symbols of renewal and continuity. Yet the work under Cologne Cathedral remained oddly muted. Doppelfeld's team laboured largely out of the public eye, documenting their discoveries but not exactly inviting broad attention. Only a small number of photographs from the late 1940s and early 1950s have surfaced. Men in deep trenches beneath the cathedral, dwarfed by massive stone walls that appear far too heavy and perfectly set to have been handled purely with medieval tools and techniques. Looking at these surviving images, you can almost step into the atmosphere of that dig. Dim light filtering down from above, timber supports and ladders clinging to vertical walls of earth, gigantic blocks appearing out of the darkness, and that lingering impression that something much older and more deliberate was hiding just under the foundations of one of Europe's most iconic churches. This is where the Tartaria perspective enters, not as a declaration, but as a lens, a way of looking. Some independent researchers propose that certain monumental structures, including cathedrals like Cologne, might not be purely medieval creations built from the ground up, but rather inheritances, later constructions placed over the remains of an older, advanced civilization. In that view, the knowledge of stone cutting, load distribution, and structural engineering on display in such foundations would exceed what the official medieval timeline comfortably allows. From this angle, the 1946 excavation might not simply have exposed Roman foundations, as the standard account insists, but layers belonging to a pre-Roman, or at least unclassified, architectural system. A system that was reused, modified, or built over during later centuries. The deeper foundation stones, the strange alignments, the water-worn surfaces, and the precision joints all become potential clues in a larger puzzle. The historical context matters. The 1940s were chaotic. Archives were damaged, priorities shifted, and much documentation was scattered or lost. If there was ever a time when unusual archaeological observations could quietly slip out of public awareness, it was then. Additional curiosities further complicate the story. The so-called Cecilienhof, or Catherine Hall chamber, octagonal spaces, and large earlier halls under the site raise simple but uncomfortable questions. Why did such imposing foundations exist beneath what was supposed to have been a sequence of relatively modest, earlier churches? Why were certain underlying constructions so geometrically refined, so carefully laid out, and in some cases apparently older than expected? Why is the visual record incomplete, with only a fraction of the excavation process preserved or made public? Urban reconstruction after the war also altered the cathedral's surroundings. Parts of the plaza and adjacent streets were reconfigured, reshaped, or rebuilt. Some researchers suggest, again as speculation, that the area around the cathedral may once have looked very different, possibly containing additional monumental structures that were phased out, absorbed, or erased through a combination of time, conflict, and reconstruction decisions. In this first episode, the purpose is not to argue for a definitive alternative history, but to establish the setting. To place you in Cologne in 1946, when much of the city lay in ruins, and yet the cathedral rose above it like a survivor from another age. Imagine the city centre, shattered streets, hollowed out facades, skeletal buildings, and at the core of it all, a towering Gothic edifice standing in eerie contrast. Beneath that survivor, in the rubble-filled aftermath of war, archaeologists opened a door into the ground and found layers of history rising to meet them. What did they actually uncover? How old were the structures truly? Why did some subterranean chambers fail to match the building plan above? Why did certain blocks appear more refined, more advanced than they should have been? And why did a project of such potential significance drift into comparative obscurity, while other excavations of the era were proudly announced and thoroughly celebrated? Operation Unearthing Cologne Cathedral was never just about cleaning up war damage. It was a brief moment when deep times surfaced, when forgotten layers of European history found themselves, however briefly, under the glare of post-war lamps, before being covered over once again. The deeper you follow the trail of the 1946 excavations, the more the narrative seems to warp. What began as a straightforward urban archaeological project quickly turned into one of the strangest dig sites in post-war Europe. A hybrid between clearing rubble, safeguarding heritage, conducting scientific study, and, unintentionally, exposing something far older and larger than anyone anticipated. The destruction of the city centre had opened sudden access to ground that had not been visible for centuries. Buildings around the cathedral were damaged or obliterated, peeling back the upper layers of the urban landscape. In that brief opening, Doppelfeld and his team moved in, determined to document the substructure beneath the cathedral and its earlier phases. The official rationale was simple: a rare opportunity to study the Romanesque and earlier church buildings that had once stood on the site. But even within conventional scholarship, certain findings were hard to ignore. The remains of what was termed the Old Cathedral turned out to be much larger than many expected. A church whose footprint already rivaled or exceeded comparable buildings from the same period. Its layout extended unexpectedly wide, and the quality of its stonework hinted at a level of investment and skill that did not neatly match its supposed age. Some stones were cut with remarkable exactness, fitted so closely that mortar lines almost vanished to the naked eye. Doppelfeld's written descriptions of these elements are, as one would expect, cautious and technical. Yet modern readers sensitive to anomalous architecture can't help but see in them echoes of something more. In the eyes of those who entertain Tartarian or alternative architectural theories, these features are signatures of inherited megastructures, remnants of a pre-industrial civilization operating with techniques that sit awkwardly beside the tools normally attributed to the Middle Ages. Below the earlier cathedral, the team documented traces of Roman occupation. No surprise there. Cologne's Roman past is well established. What is more intriguing is not the presence of Roman material, but the character of some of the engineering. Certain foundation grids, corridors, and floor arrangements look less like the remains of ordinary Roman buildings, and more like support systems designed for much heavier loads. Large blocks appear arranged in logical, repetitive patterns, reminiscent of early structural engineering principles. Some stones show markings that resemble drill traces or mechanically regular grooves that do not easily match typical hand chiseling. Fragments of mosaics and floor tiles discovered at the site are similarly notable. Some exhibit very fine line work and strikingly consistent symmetry, the kind of careful design that leads some observers to wonder whether more advanced measuring tools might have been in play than commonly assumed. Beneath the nave, excavators identified water channels, arching tunnels, and drainage routes that evoke a complex hydraulic infrastructure rather than a simple ecclesiastical foundation. For speculative researchers, this is where patterns begin to repeat. In other European cities, monumental surface structures also appear to rest above unusually sophisticated underground systems. Networks sometimes interpret it as remnants of an older, integrated infrastructure. The parallels are impossible to prove, but difficult to ignore for those looking across multiple sites. Another point of interest lies in the materials themselves. Some of the stone types found below the cathedral do not originate in the immediate region. Conventional historians attribute this to historical trade routes and river transport, which certainly did exist. But critics question whether the sheer volume and scale of non-local stone, combined with the precision of its cutting and placement, really align with our current expectations of medieval logistics and technology. If, on the other hand, the foundations were much older and only later reused, that might explain why so many blocks appear almost standardized, as if they were components of a modular system rather than one-off carved pieces. The excavations also revealed deep floor layers, surfaces and structures buried under several meters of sediment, fill, and mixed debris. Some propose that this indicates multiple cycles of flooding, rebuilding, and reconfiguration over many centuries. Others, especially those looking through the Tartarian lens, consider a more radical possibility, that a much older, extensive structure once occupied the site, later buried and forgotten. The old photographs taken by Doppelfeld's team show workers standing beside immense foundations and arched forms emerging from earth like the bones of a colossal machine. In some images, doorways appear halfway buried, leading sideways into darkness. These visuals form a core part of the modern alternative narrative, because they display a scale and style that seem, at minimum, unusual when measured against the conventional story of a cathedral whose construction spanned from the 13th to the 19th century. The catalogue from the excavations includes pottery, metal fragments, sculpted stones, and decorative pieces. Some items fit neatly into Roman or medieval categories. Others resist easy classification. Certain ornamented stones and geometric reliefs appear almost mathematically precise, while some motifs feel oddly foreign, inviting comparisons to Eastern, steppe, or hybrid influences. To those inclined toward a Tartarian worldview, these details hint at a once wide architectural language now largely erased or rebranded under later styles. Doppelfeld, digging deeper, peeled back layer after layer of urban history. The official narrative still frames these layers as a logical sequence: Roman, then early Christian, then medieval. Yet, a number of features remain difficult to reconcile fully with that linear progression. Stone vaults that seem too technically advanced for their assigned period. Structural elements that look more like components of a complex mechanical or energetic system than mere reinforcing blocks. Metal objects discovered in lower layers that, while officially described as construction debris or tool remnants, are sometimes reinterpreted by alternative researchers as pieces of unknown architectural technology. Some of the floor tiles uncovered beneath the cathedral are laid in interlocking arrangements that suggest deliberate load management or vibration control. Traits more at home in modern engineering than in early medieval building practice. Certain underground arches are aligned with such consistency that they resemble a carefully tuned subfloor support system, not a haphazard accumulation of repairs and phases. These observations are not in themselves proof of a hidden civilization, but they raise questions that extend far beyond Cologne. Are we seeing the normal extremes of medieval craftsmanship and Roman engineering? Or are we glimpsing fragments of a much older construction tradition, partially inherited and partially misunderstood? Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Cologne excavation story is its fleeting nature. It was not a slow, planned research program spanning decades. It was an emergency-era project, wedged into the broader effort to stabilize and rebuild a shattered city. As quickly as the window into those deep layers opened, it began to close. Trenches were backfilled, chambers were reinforced or sealed. The extraordinary views into the subterranean architecture were, in many cases, temporary, captured only in a few black and white frames. Episode 2 becomes the center of the enigma, that brief historical moment when shovels and picks struck stone that did not seem to belong to the expected sequence. Stone that, according to some, hints at a civilization older, more capable, and far more sophisticated than anything formerly recorded beneath Cologne's Gothic skyline. Stone that forces us to ask a simple, unsettling question. What exactly was Cologne Cathedral built upon? And why do some of its deepest foundations look so advanced for their assigned age? Now we stand in front of the layered cross-section uncovered by Doppelfeld's team, looking not just at one building, but at multiple eras compressed into the ground beneath a single cathedral. The deeper the excavation went, the less the site resembled a tidy stack of well-labeled historical phases, and the more it began to look like a hurried burial of entire worlds. It is as if successive generations, confronted with remnants they did not fully understand, simply covered them, raised the floor, and constructed new levels above. Even the surviving official reports read, at times, like attempts to describe something that wouldn't quite stay within the margins of the established chronology. The language is academic, but between the lines, there are hints of surprise, of unexpected complexity, of features that sit uneasily within the standard Roman to medieval progression. According to the conventional timeline, Cologne Cathedral's major Gothic construction phase began in the 13th century and reached its final completion in the 19th century. Yet, in 1946, Doppelfeld's team found that not all the underlying structures conformed neatly to medieval or Roman expectations. Some looked like they belonged to something else, something rigorously planned, highly geometric, and executed with precision that recalled the stone mastery, typically associated with the world's great megalithic sites. What is particularly striking about the excavation photographs is the juxtaposition. Above ground, the familiar Gothic church, its arches, towers, and tracery. Below ground, large blocks arranged in patterns that do not mimic the layout above. There are narrow channels, circular depressions, intricate stone pavements whose designs do not correspond to the known floor plans. Some walls display surfaces so finely finished that imagining them carved with simple hand tools and no mechanical assistance stretches the imagination. One of the recurring questions is depth. Why did these features lie so far below the modern surface, buried beneath thick layers of earth, rubble, and reconstructed floors? If all of this was merely part of standard Roman development, why does it differ so much from typical Roman remains elsewhere in the region, many of which are comparatively modest and less refined? A speculative theory, not offered as truth, but as a thought experiment, suggests that Europe may once have contained enclaves of high-level construction, fragments of a technologically capable culture, whose building practices left behind scattered, overbuilt foundations. Under this lens, Cologne Cathedral becomes less a singular medieval achievement and more a later layer anchored into the bones of something much older. Doppelfeld's notes mention unusually hard stones, blocks that were exceptionally well cut, and elements that seemed disproportionately heavy and carefully fitted. Some junctions between stones required no mortar at all, relying instead on their perfect alignment to remain stable, a method that appears in megalithic architecture in other parts of the world, but is not typically associated with medieval Germany. If a mid-20th century excavation team expecting ordinary Roman and medieval remains felt compelled to remark on such features, that in itself is noteworthy. It suggests that they saw something beyond their initial expectations, something that resisted easy classification. Among the discoveries were deep pits and chamber-like spaces beneath the nave. Many were packed with rubble that looked as though it had been deliberately placed there long before the 20th century. The walls surrounding some of these voids showed signs of older damage, as if they had been broken or dismantled centuries earlier, partially collapsing or being intentionally modified. It raises the question, were earlier groups already altering or concealing these subterranean spaces, long before modern archaeology took notice? Particularly puzzling are the circular stone forms visible in some photographs, perfectly rounded, carefully edged, embedded deep within the structure. The conventional explanation is that these are remnants of wells, baptismal basins, or functional Roman installations. Yet, the degree of symmetry and the fine shaping of these elements spark alternative interpretations. Could they have had a different purpose, perhaps as part of an unknown mechanical or energetic system integrated into a larger network of underground architecture? The idea may sound extreme, but it gains a bit of context when we remember that many cities around the world sit atop older cities, temples, labyrinths, and infrastructures. Fortresses built over previous sanctuaries, churches over older shrines, entire districts over long forgotten tunnels. This pattern is well documented. In Cologne's case, the depth at which some of these chambers were found, more than 3 or 4 meters below the surface, suggests either extraordinary sedimentation, repeated large-scale flooding, or deliberate burial. Doppelfeld's notes reportedly mention walls that were not just collapsed, but intentionally filled in, as if someone had made a conscious decision to block access. When combined with evidence of intense, ancient burning on certain stones, scorch marks far older than modern warfare, the scene begins to resemble not just gradual change, but dramatic events, followed by purposeful concealment. The stone floors below, arranged in carefully leveled patterns, some with polygons and interlocking slabs, look overqualified for ordinary supporting functions. In certain places, they resemble designs found in older architectural traditions outside Central Europe. Again, this does not prove anything revolutionary, but it enlarges the field of possibilities. The underground corridors present yet another layer of intrigue. Some are narrow and consistent with known Roman layouts. Others are broader, smoother, and curiously elegant, their arcs and proportions not quite matching the styles typically associated with Roman or medieval Cologne. In some sections, the tunnels curve as though they once extended well beyond the excavated area, only to be truncated and walled off at later times. This raises a tantalizing question. Could there once have been a far-reaching underground network beneath the city, much more elaborate than what we now assume, and mostly lost under centuries of construction and destruction? And if so, why choose this exact spot, later crowned by the Gothic cathedral, as the center point? Was the site already regarded as special, powerful, or sacred long before any church stood above it? Historically, it is widely acknowledged that many European cathedrals occupy locations previously used for other religious or ceremonial purposes. The idea that Cologne Cathedral might stand on a site revered long before Christianization is not controversial in itself. What is more controversial is the suggestion that the structures below might represent not just earlier worship halls, but fragments of a more technologically capable building culture. Another curious aspect of the story is the fate of the photographic record. Many of the images taken in the 1940s were not made readily available to the public for decades. When they finally surfaced in larger numbers, they began to circulate among historians, archivists, and later researchers, interested in lost or suppressed architectural knowledge. The delay in their accessibility naturally fuels speculation. Was it simply archival inertia and lack of public interest? Or was there an underlying discomfort in presenting anomalies that did not easily fit established categories? As the excavators dug deeper, additional evidence of water management emerged. Channels, conduits, and carved routes that seemed part of a much larger hydraulic design than medieval Cologne is usually credited with. To those exploring alternative histories, such features form part of a broader pattern that repeats in various cities. Large monumental structures resting on top of intricate water systems whose original function is no longer entirely clear. In this final episode, we descend into the last unresolved questions of Operation Unearthing Cologne Cathedral and examine the anomalies that historians acknowledge but rarely linger on for long. We now have the context: the war-torn city, the emergency excavation, the tangled layering of Roman, medieval, and possibly earlier constructions. The question that remains is not, what is the official story? But, what do the details suggest when we place them side by side? We are left with a patchwork of evidence: photographs, partial reports, architectural drawings, and Doppelfeld's notes. None of these alone rewrite history. Together, however, they form a strange and stubborn configuration. A pattern of precision-cut blocks, buried chambers, sealed corridors, unexpected materials, and odd depth levels that refuses to settle into a perfectly linear narrative. One of the most striking aspects is the precision of the masonry in certain subterranean vaults. These are attributed to the Romanesque period, yet their execution often looks closer to industrial-level stone fabrication than to hand-carved medieval work. The stones sometimes appear almost polished, with edges so crisp that it is difficult to imagine them produced with nothing more than chisels and simple measuring tools. Officially, they are still framed as products of human labor and basic instruments, but their quality prompts recurring debate. The arches supporting certain underground corridors are another key detail. Their curves are so consistent their joints so finely executed that modern engineers looking at the images sometimes remark on the level of control implied. The uneven positioning of some columns, some sunk, others appearing too high relative to later floors, suggests that ground levels shifted dramatically, or that parts of older structures were repurposed in ways that altered their original orientation. This ties into a broader theme that appears across Europe. Buildings with half-buried windows, doorways now below street level, and facades that seem to emerge from the earth rather than stand fully above it. Explanations usually invoke rising street levels, centuries of debris accumulation, and urban redevelopment. Yet, in some cases, the vertical difference is so significant that it hints at something more drastic: major inundations, sediment events, or deliberate infill. At Cologne, the evidence of heavily compacted layers and sealed voids beneath the cathedral fits uncomfortably well within this larger pattern. The surviving notes from Doppelfeld mention layers of earth that appear unusually dense, as if they had been packed rather than simply deposited over time. Other records refer to cracks leading into darker cavities, and to walls that seemed to have been reinforced by builders earlier than the Gothic masons. These hints give rise to an idea that mainstream history doesn't readily endorse, but cannot fully disprove: that the Gothic cathedral may not be the first large-scale structure on the site, but merely the latest in a succession of monumental buildings. The official version already acknowledges earlier churches. But what happens if some of the stonework beneath those churches does not match their style, or any recognized Roman or medieval style at all? Some blocks appear oversized, too perfect, too standardized. They lack the kind of visible tool marks typical of medieval craftsmanship. Instead, they resemble the smooth, regular, interlocking blocks seen in sites that remain controversial to this day. From this emerges the speculative notion that the medieval builders may have inherited a pre-existing foundation they neither designed nor fully understood. They might have simply used what was already there, cutting, adapting, and adding, but leaving the deeper structure largely intact. The Gothic cathedral, then, would be a spectacular last layer on a far older architectural palimpsest. Fragments of metal found embedded in lower stone layers deepen the mystery. Official interpretations label them as remnants of earlier construction, tools, or supportive elements. Yet, the reported descriptions, melted shapes, partly crystallized forms, pieces fused directly into the masonry, have inspired alternative readings. If one entertains the possibility of advanced ancient engineering, these fragments could be seen as traces of technological systems integrated into the architecture, perhaps related to stabilization, conduction, or unknown mechanical functions. What amplifies the intrigue is that similar oddities have been documented beneath other cathedrals and monumental buildings across Europe. Buried arches, oversized foundations, sealed lower levels, anomalous metals. None of these are unique to Cologne. They reappear in cities like Prague, Paris, Milan, and several British sites, suggesting either a shared pattern of reuse and reconstruction, or, in the eyes of alternative researchers, a scattered legacy of a once coherent architectural tradition. Post-excavation decisions complicate things further. After the war, stabilizing Cologne Cathedral was a priority. In practice, this meant that some areas were carefully preserved and studied, while others were filled, concreted, or closed off to ensure structural safety. From a practical engineering perspective, these choices are understandable, but they also mean that certain chambers, corridors, and features visible in the 1946 photographs are no longer accessible. Some of the most intriguing anomalies may now be permanently sealed. Public memory has largely bypassed all of this. Most visitors walking into Cologne Cathedral today have no idea that below the floor lies a labyrinth of rooms, walls, and foundations once revealed in startling clarity. The story of Operation Unearthing has remained mostly within the realm of specialists, archivists, and enthusiasts of old architecture. The average tourist sees the stained glass, the altars, the soaring vaults, and never suspects the perplexing engineering puzzles concealed beneath. Some alternative researchers propose that the Cologne site represents one of many layered monuments, structures built not in a single cultural moment, but through repeated accretions over a base so old its origins have faded into myth. Under this hypothesis, the mismatched foundations, the strange precision work, and the buried arches are leftovers from a tradition older than our recorded medieval and Roman stories. Each new generation built on what was already there, adding its own signature while quietly burying the earlier one. Whether or not such theories are correct, the material evidence demands curiosity. Why do some foundation stones look machine-made? Why do certain chambers feel oversized for their supposed function? Why were metallic elements found so deep in the structure? Why do some architectural features sit under layers of compacted earth thick enough to suggest either massive environmental shifts or deliberate concealment? The conventional answer closes the case with references to normal reconstruction phases, changing ground levels, and long urban histories. And perhaps that is all there is. Yet, the visual and textual record, produced in 1946, leaves room for another possibility: that what we see today as Cologne Cathedral is not just a standalone Gothic marvel, but the visible tip of an older, more complex, and still partly unexplained architectural iceberg. Operation Unearthing Cologne Cathedral did not last long. However, in that short burst of activity, it allowed the world a rare glimpse into the deep structural memory of a historic site. For a moment, the ground opened and revealed layers of construction that seemed to hint at forgotten techniques, lost knowledge, and cultural sequences far more intricate than a simple linear timeline suggests. And so this documentary closes not with a verdict, but with a question. Perhaps Cologne Cathedral is both what official history says it is: a towering Gothic achievement, and something more. Perhaps it is also a monument anchored into foundations whose first builders remain unknown, whose tools and methods are missing from our textbooks, and whose legacy survives only in sealed chambers, buried stonework, and a few grainy photographs from 1946. For most people, those secrets are out of sight, reclaimed by the earth and the weight of the structures above. For those who look closer, they remain an open invitation to wonder what else might be hidden beneath the stories we think we know.